to solve the problem, how we may have misunderstood the problem that we were looking to solve, how the solutions created new problems, how we tried to solve those new problems, and what are the kind of new concerns. This is actually a rapidly moving terrain right now, and what kind of creative ways we have to address them. So there's a lot to cover, so I'm going to go along. So it starts out, there's a persistent myth. If I were there, I'd ask you how many of you have heard that 30% of urban traffic is people looking for parking, and maybe you could, raise a hand and let me know if you've heard that statistic before. I hear it all the time. So it looks like a few of you have as well. So here's a quote from Zia Youssef, who is the CEO of Streetline. They're a company that makes parking sensors. Experts believe 30% of urban traffic is searching for parking. Professor Zhang Guo, who's a friend and colleague of mine at NYU, 30% of cars are looking for a place to park. He said that on the Marketplace radio show. Alan Greenberg, who funds a lot of congestion management and parking pricing studies. He works for USDOT. He says, where studied, 8 to 74% of city traffic is caused by motorists circling for parking. And the genesis of that statistic is the table that you see there on the left, which was produced by Dr. Shoup. And one of the things that's notable on the table is that you can see we've been worrying about parking all the way back into the 1920s. So what this implies, and the kind of concern that this caused, is that that this lack of parking or inability to find parking creates a lot of extra traffic, delays, and unnecessary emissions, and sort of this idea of spillover, which essentially is when the demand for parking at one land use intrudes on the supply of parking for another. And sometimes this gets sort of boiled down to mean even parking in the public right of way, such that if you are my neighbor and you're parked in front of my house, it is surely the case that there's not enough parking in front of your house. And this recently has become a huge concern all across the country as new development is being shunned because existing residents are afraid that if there's not enough parking in the new development, the new residents will encroach on the parking that they've been enjoying all of this time. So there's an easy fix to that, and that is we'll just institute off-street parking requirements. So pretty straightforward solution there. So what have we got with that? Here's the Marina Towers, one of my favorites, iconic building, 60 stories in each tower. The first 19 floors are parking. That's a lot of real estate. We've created all kinds of unpleasant walking environments, spreading our land uses further and further apart. Design is really an important factor, which I'll come back to talking about in a little bit. Here are just more examples. Off-street parking sometimes is parking on the sidewalk, upper left, parking under a mountain, the lower right. So frequently also in commercial contexts, having a parking supplied is considered an economic development strategy. And this is something that I've been dealing with in a project in Jersey City right now, sort of without thought to what might be other economic development strategies or what does parking actually do or not do for us. So such is our thirst for parking that there really is no better place to leave your car than here in the historic Michigan Theater in Detroit. So what we've done, as you all are quite familiar, I'm sure, is we have required parking through our zoning codes, and what that has created is a built environment that winds up being, I'll just go right here, sometimes more parking than space. So these are the requirements. The black squares are parking space requirements. One square is 10 spots relative to building space. In this case, it's for a house of worship that accommodates 400 people. And these are just some examples from around the country. They seem somewhat random and arbitrary, and I believe they may well be. And again, here the result is that you wind up with far more parking, land devoted to parking than to actual gathering space. I particularly like this particular use case because I'm reminded of, I was giving once a talk in Louisville, Kentucky, and one of the people came to me afterwards and said that his synagogue had been wanting to move location, but they couldn't find a spot that had enough parking available to accommodate the congregation on Yom Kippur. So that is certainly the biggest turnout holiday. And so essentially what he was saying to me is because they couldn't organize carpools or use shuttles or encourage active transport, they wound up, they didn't make the move because they couldn't find an adequate facility, but essentially they were looking to guarantee that their parking would be oversupplied 364 days a year. So same example, office space, you get essentially, these are generous offices in the diagram. You could probably fit, let's see, I think you can fit 3 workstations or 4 workstations in the space that it takes to park 1 car. There's no real count on this, but at a minimum, there's 3 to 4 parking spaces per car in the US. Some experts have estimated that there may be as many as 8. So at a minimum, between 66 and 75% of spaces are empty at any given time. Houston, a city that brags no zoning code, is estimated to have 30 parking spaces per resident. And that's because even without zoning, they mandate minimum parking in their building code. So we did understand already by the 1980s that parking begets driving. 3 US cities included parking maximums in their compliance plans for air quality standards as part of their plan to bring their areas into attainment from the non-attainment status. And those were Boston, Portland, and New York City. Just sort of, here's a Rocky Mountain Institute trivia. They are estimating peak car in 2020. So it sounds like we are here. We'll see if their prediction is true or not. So then comes the question is the problem, this solution, it's unclear that it actually solved a real problem. So I set to looking a little bit at how much cruising there actually is. So using a large database of GPS traces, I was able to look at, let me see if I can use this as a pointer. This is a trip trace. This is a trip trace coming over the bridge, coming down the street here. And then this is another trip trace. There's a data gap there. So in these 3 examples, we see what car drivers are doing based on the information that we get from their navigation systems. So using these data and working with 2 colleagues that I work with on a number of studies, Adam Millard-Boyle and Robert Hampshire, we determined that in San Francisco, between 5 and 6 trips, 5 and 6% of trips involve some kind of parking search. We looked also at Ann Arbor, where it was about 3%. This is actually ongoing work. We're trying to figure out how to make this tool and data available for everybody so anybody can figure out what's going on in their city. By our estimates, that amounted to a little bit less than 1% of VMT. So this 30% cruising as an impetus for public policy starts to come into question. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. INREX put out a study a couple of years ago indicating that 17 hours a year are wasted, and that's based on their own GPS data. So I did a little math on that. So I assumed, just for simplicity, so the federal highway says drivers log about 13,500 miles per year. I assumed half of that was on the highway and half in an urban context. You know, we could quibble over that. So that came up to about 449 hours of driving. And then I said, well, 17 hours is what percent of 450 hours? And it's a little bit under 4%. So that's corroboration there. And then I said, okay, parking search I assumed was at the at the lower speed end of it. So I figured, well, how many miles is covered in 17 hours of parking? And so it's about 2.5% of the total miles logged. So, but the big concern I have with the INRIC study is that the entire presentation is still in terms of, they estimate $73 billion of wasted time, because if you multiply 17 hours over every driver in the US, you get that. And they also estimated that people overpay parking fees by $20 billion, or I think it was, I can't remember now, $97 per driver per year, so as to avoid getting a ticket. And so this was, 73 billion wasted dollars. And the presentation of that report was really made it seem like the solution again was, well, we need to really rethink our parking strategy and make it easier to avoid this kind of a problem. Shoup says that we subsidize parking to the tune of $127 billion per year. So maybe those balance out, but there were still $50 billion in the subsidy direction, looking at all of those numbers. So what is the perception of parking shortage and the reality? These are a couple of international examples that I like. Up here, we're in Ahmedabad, India, and here in Harbin in China. Oops, sorry, that was the wrong move there. Both of these on-street situations are literally directly above these absolutely empty, completely empty garages. So, so then also, and this is an example of Oxnard, California, where an inventory was taken. And what we see is, while we frequently understand there to be spot shortages, and those feel like they feel very directly to the person who's looking for a parking place, like there really is no place to park, when the reality frequently is that there's parking quite nearby. Now in this example, we're showing garages and on-street parking, and where you see red, you're full, and where you see yellow, well, here's the key. There's your occupancy levels, and where you see green, there's obviously ample parking. So San Francisco has taken this on, which I'll talk about in a bit. Los Angeles also, but the case with Los Angeles is they've actually would have a different price on the red side of the street compared with the orange side of the street in their effort to even that out. So what I've found in my work is that parking is in fact overwhelmingly oversupplied. By about 65% on average in US small and medium downtowns. And this is based on looking at 27 studies of parking using this kind of a parking inventory that I'm showing here, several of which were done for economic development purposes. Some of them were done because there was a perceived parking shortage, and there was no difference in the outcome regardless of the reason for the study. So essentially this shows that the levels of parking provided are pretty much disconnected from demand because their parking is so overwhelmingly oversupplied. It's very difficult to price it because it can't really be commoditized that way. It has no effect on travel behavior. And I couldn't find any reason why travel behavior was affected by parking supply, because parking was so oversupplied. It's a little bit alarming. We continue to do this. This is a recent mall development on the east side of Manhattan. You can see in this example, more square footage is devoted to parking than it is to the actual retail use. So there's lower ratables, there's more parking, and the maximum observed occupancy in this lot is 40%. And this is in a situation where parking is considered to be a severe shortage. So here is well, I want to actually, before I move on to this, just say that what we see too is that in most markets, developers build only to what the minimum is, which suggests that minimum parking requirements are a potential constraint on development and may well suppress development. So the promise and the reality of off-street parking, just to sum this up a little bit, its promise was to put an end to cruising, put an end to negative externalities of spillover, and that it was very critical to the success of downtown economies, when in reality, it's had a mixed effect on cruising. This parking has introduced other externalities, and it's potentially deadening to downtown economies rather than critical to the success of downtown economies. So why does it pay to cruise? So unless you're on and off-street parking and the parking pricing in particular are coordinated, sometimes it pays quite handsomely for you to look around for parking place. So just sort of a simple example, let's say metered parking costs $1 an hour. I know it's more than that in the Denver area, but that's actually what it costs to park anywhere in New York City at a metered space outside of Manhattan. So, and let's say your garage is $10 an hour. So if I drive for 10 minutes and find a spot, I've saved $9 an hour for parking. So I've just paid myself the equivalent rate of a six-figure salary there. So if I'm parking for 2 hours, it's quite a bonus, right? So and that's only in the dollar per hour scenario, because in fact 98% of on-street parking is actually free. So we know in terms of some of the externalities, increases the cost of development. It shifts the parking costs from users to the developers, and which then distributes it to users of the development, not just users of the parking, and subsidizes tremendously to auto use. So essentially, when parking is required, for example, in your home, when you purchase your home, you have made a down payment on your car. So essentially you get more car ownership than you would if those markets were separated, and you get less home ownership or home building than you would have. So those are some of the externalities associated there, and contributes to this cycle of automobile dependence, because essentially what happens is, as you require automobile infrastructure, you get more automobile ownership, so then you need more automobile infrastructure. It deadens the environment for other uses, and it's sort of a self-fulfilling problem. So this first idea proved actually to be not a very good idea. It privileged parking at the expense of other things. And because it guaranteed parking, it guaranteed driving, and it exacerbated the very problem, therefore, that it was trying to solve. So that suggests the next solution, which is to eliminate parking minimums. So this has been done in very few places, notably the city of Buffalo, city of San Francisco, a few places of San Francisco again, and Arlington County, Virginia, for example, require unbundling of parking, which means it cannot be sold together in a bundle with whatever the primary use is. The idea is still gaining traction. Hopefully it's an idea that we can advance here. So, so the next solution then is to better manage your parking supply. So there's been a renaissance in thinking here, possibly due to the fact of Donald Shoup relentlessly beating the drum on this issue. Partly maybe because the idea finally needed to take hold again. But essentially, a lot of places now are taking the view that managing the supply that they have is probably a better idea than simply trying to add to the supply without any kind of management, especially when we see the excess supply that we've got. So the new thinking is that improper management leads to double parking, spot shortages, cruising. Good management can be achieved by pricing. And then there's an idea of an 85% occupancy. It's a heuristic that's widely used to be the right target, and it's been increasingly adopted. So I want to just take a minute and note, too, that parking meters were first introduced in 1935 in Oklahoma City. And the idea there was the shopkeeper noticed that his employees were parking in front of his store, so that when his customers came, they weren't able to find parking, and it was very discouraging for them. So he convinced the city council that by starting to price the parking, that would encourage the employees to park on the next block over and leave spaces free for the customers to use. So it worked beautifully at the beginning. Eventually, we lost the political will to pace the pricing as a management tool. And so then parking really came to be seen, or metered parking, I should say, just as a revenue generator for the city and not as the management tool that it originally was conceived as. So the prime US example of what we call performance pricing was the San Francisco example, SF Park, and they were very big on technology. Through technology, pricing better, they'd get a better outcome. Seattle has done something very similar, but in a very low-tech kind of a way. And again, the idea here, you see the northwest side of the block is completely overparked, and the northeast side of the block has lots of spaces available. And the idea then is to set a price on these blocks that matches the demand that you have. So one of the things that we forget a lot when we talk about demand for parking is that demand and supply are usually mediated also by price. And so, so since most parking is unpriced, the whole question of understanding supply and demand takes on a different kind of a meaning. So once you can do performance pricing, you also can coordinate your off and on street so that you can get the kind of outcome that you're interested in. I don't think I need to explain this. I think it's pretty evident. So what is the occupancy goal? 85% is well understood. I've tried to trace it back. I found a Bureau of Public Roads study from 1956 called Parking in Cities. They say 85 to 90% to avoid a problem. So in San Francisco, they set it at 60 to 80% just to make sure that they caught all the margins that they were interested in. So this is another project that I did with Adam Millard-Bull and Robert Hampshire, where we used the sensor data in San Francisco to do some simulations of cruising for parking. And we had to understand really what was the probability that somebody would find a parking space if they were looking for one. And what we learned here is that when the parking meters are turned off, which is right at this point here, the average number of blocks cruised skyrockets, even though the rate at which people are coming to park is decreasing also rapidly. And so essentially what we did is a lot of research to find out what I think you guys already understand from the fact that your Sunday meters are turned off, which is that on Sundays it's harder to park. So when the meters are not running, people aren't sharing as nicely as we might like them to. So San Francisco, the SF Park project was a success. At every subsequent price change, the system converged to their goals, but it's a little bit unclear in the end that they actually had the right policy objective. And I'll just take a minute to talk about what does parking look like as the parking space sees it. So in this example, I've got a street that from 8 a.m. to 8:30 a.m. is 60% occupied, and from 8:30 to 9, it is fully occupied. And so it's in the average in that hour, it's 80% occupied, which is precisely within the program objectives. But we don't know really what is happening from the driver's perspective. So here's parking as a driver sees it, which is that 50% of the time they found a space and 50% of the time they did not, right? So we don't actually know how many people came to park in that location. And that requires us to know the arrival rate of the parkers. So a potentially more important or a more accurate way of looking at this would be to understand, to have a goal of a space available, right? So the 80% occupancy or 85% occupancy sort of to cover the idea that a space should be available, but we can actually count the percentage of time either in 15 or minute or 5-minute increments, whatever increment you want, and come up with some measure of how often is a space actually available. So the next solution then is to treat parking as part of the transportation system, not a part of the land use system. And so let me just say about that, frequently we look at parking as a function of land use. It's regulated as a function of land use. We have this additional disconnect where off-street parking certainly is a land use function and usually regulated by city planning departments, whereas on-street parking is typically run by departments of transportation or public works. So, so here are a couple of some of my favorite examples of adaptive reuse. I don't know, some of you might be familiar with some of these. The lower left is the Musée d'Orsay, which is a fantastic modern art museum, not modern, contemporary, that used to be a train station. And so sort of forces you to ask the question of whether a train station and a museum have the same parking requirements. The Berkeley Bowl used to be a bowling alley and then became a grocery store. And for many years was a grocery store and now is actually an outdoor gear retailer. On the upper right there is the Limelight, which was for many years a house of worship and then became a notorious nightclub and now is a boutique mall. And the lower picture is just a place near where I live that was for many years a cabinet making shop and then became a bar. So all of these buildings have parking requirements associated with their use. And so here's the Berkeley Bowl example. These are its 3 different uses in the time that I've been familiar with it and the required parking according to what the local ordinance is. I don't know why a grocery store and outdoor gear store would have the same parking requirements. That's a little bit gets back to the earlier slides I was showing where there seems to be some sort of randomness associated. And there's my Limelight, church, 210 spaces, nightclub, 115, retail mall, 90. So fortunately, the parking requirement is going down because had it been going up in this example, maybe there would have been a problem in constructing that. So also in residential use, most residential zoning requirements need you to have as many parking spaces as you might expect at the peak usage. And here's just an example I made up of a potential life cycle, which is, you know, when you're young, you've got no cars, and then you're done with college and you get a car, and then you form a family and you get 2 cars, and then your kids become teenagers and you have 3 cars. But that only lasts for a couple of years because then they go to college and then they move out on their own and then you start reducing cars. So in this, you know, sort of 40, 50 year life of living in the same house, most of the time you have only 1 car, some of the time you have 2, a teeny bit of the time you have 3, but all of the time you have enough infrastructure to park all 3 of your cars. So this gets really to be a problem when it suppresses development. And this is an example in Minnesota. I won't say where, but the building there had been a toy store and required 3 parking spaces. And the owner wanted to create a wine bar, which needed 9 spaces. And the lower image shows the block and the amount of parking available in the vicinity. And they made an agreement with a dry cleaner over here to lease 6 of the spaces from them to make up their full complement of the required parking. And then they asked the city council to allow variance for that, and that was denied. So the city council essentially, or the zoning board of appeals, I guess, in fact, preferred an empty storefront to adding to the vibrancy of the block because they felt that they needed to respect the parking requirements in the zoning code. So the question of design is a pretty critical one. Design for what you want. It's an important adage. If you design for cars, you'll get cars. If you design for people, you are more likely to get people. And here's an example of 2 neighborhoods in Philadelphia that I looked at some years ago with a former student of mine, Donnie Maley. actually looked at 6 neighborhoods. This is 2 of them, and these streets look pretty similar, and these neighborhoods are very similar. It was a matched pair kind of a study. But when you turn around from the perspective of this particular photograph, what you see is right below 2 grocery stores. So this one is set back in your sort of classic grocery store design. There's a sea of parking. And then this one fronts on the seat with the parking available up above. So we went into the community and we surveyed people who lived within a half a mile of each of these grocery stores and verified that they shopped at that grocery store. And we discovered that the people who lived near this grocery store were far, far, far more likely to drive to get groceries than were the people who lived in this area and lived in the vicinity of this grocery store. And it's not because the parking wasn't available, it's just because parking here was really truly invited, whereas parking here was accommodated. So that really has a potential, a tremendous impact there. So sharing is another critically important potential solution. So what we see is you can vastly reduce your parking supply while serving the same peak demand. So essentially the accessory minimums really were designed to provide enough parking, sort of in theory, to meet the peak demand at any particular use, without really appreciating the fact that different uses have different time of day peaking characteristics. So if the movie theater can share parking with the hardware store and vice versa, then each one of them needs to provide less parking. So I like the example of Sacramento, which has really taken this concept to the extreme. I think 5 years ago, they completed construction on a brand new 19,000 seat stadium in the downtown, and they didn't build a single new parking space. So normally that would probably, that would be a lot of parking, and at $40,000 to $50,000 per space for a structured space, and in the California context, potentially even more expensive because of the seismic considerations. What they did instead is they identified over 13,000 parking spaces within a half-mile walk of the stadium, and they negotiated with the owners of those facilities to allow those parking spaces to be used to serve the stadium clientele, and they promoted other access modes like transit, the TNCs, Uber and Lyft, other livery services. So, so sharing really does reduce your supply while serving the same peak, and by reducing your supply, you create a lot of new opportunities to create and develop more active uses. So curb management, really, I'd be remiss not to talk about it a little bit here. So curb management really is the current frontier in parking, and that is because the explosion in urban goods delivery, the explosion in alternative livery, the explosion in microtransit, and also in micromobility generally, bike sharing, scooter sharing, and so forth. There's just a lot more demands on the curb than there ever have been. So this is just a graphic from Seattle DOT, who's been very front and center in thinking about this, and trying to think about it in a systematic way. What are the different components of the street canyon? There's the pedestrian realm. Is the sidewalk wide enough? Can it be widened? In this particular project, it turns out that only about 25% of the curb lane in the Seattle CBD is devoted to parking, and yet is universally referred to as the parking lane. So other uses of that lane are mobility uses. So sometimes they're express bus lanes, well, not express bus lanes, but exclusive bus lanes, or turn pockets, or they're used for safety, or they're a bike lane. Safety, I mean a fire hydrant, or just daylighting, or sometimes they're used for access, such as a bus stop, or a load zone. So really understanding what is happening at your curb, and trying to prioritize how that works. And then their next emphasis was in their particular case, looking at whether the modal plans were being well served. So once they had a good understanding of how the curve was used and understanding what the functions really were of the curve rather than just even the uses, then they set out to prioritize what they were meant to be. So I think I actually gone a little bit more quickly than I intended to, so we should have lots of time for discussion after. But essentially, I just kind of want to highlight a couple of things. Parking requirements have been shown repeatedly to impede development, to distort markets, to impact mode choices, to really contribute to a cycle of auto dependence. I might talk for a second more about the INRIX study, which had a very alarmist tone. And it was based on a survey of 6,000 drivers, right? So they didn't even take into consideration the perspective of, well, there's people accessing locations without driving, and maybe we could actually create an environment where there are fewer people driving. Overwhelmingly, we've tried to fix parking by adding to the supply without really understanding the dynamics or truly understanding whether the supply was adequate. Sometimes, I showed the example of the grocery store as a street design question. Sometimes there's an issue with the street design. If there's there could be parking available a short distance. There was a case I'm familiar with in a Massachusetts, small town Massachusetts, where they were wanting to build a new structured garage and then discovered that actually there was an empty garage quite nearby, which nobody was using because there was a very complicated intersection that was very difficult to cross. And they tabled the garage and addressed the intersection, which helped not only their parking problem, but also made for a much livelier intersection and street life. So this is a picture of a parking garage in Wichita, which actually has been converted to residential uses. So I find that somewhat hopeful. And I'm going to end there with this photograph that I took in Budapest, which does seem to be indicating that the cars should park on the sidewalk, and some English speaker came by and expressed their distress at such a concept. So thanks for your time, and I am looking forward to discussion and answering any questions that you may have.
So if you have a question for Rachel, just raise your hand and Amy and I will have microphones and we can come over to you.
Well, I can see you much better now that I'm not looking at my own slides.
Oh yeah, there we go. Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. Fantastic information and really important as we think about how we, as you said, design for people and not cars, which is amazing. One of my question is, so often when we're having this conversation with developers about how much parking they are willing to, or how little parking they're willing to build, they blame the investor, the investment bankers. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship and about how our ability to influence their investment choices?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and I am terribly ill prepared to answer it. I have heard that many times. The banks are very conservative. That's not news to anybody. One of the things that I think helps the banks is for the local laws to be consistent with what the developer wants to do. And another thing I'll say about Sacramento that they've done very effectively is they also have allowed developers to demonstrate that they are meeting the parking minimum requirements by contracting with nearby available parking that's unused. So essentially they're saying, well, you need to provide this many parking spaces, but you don't need to actually build them and they don't have to be on site. So if you can find them, including on street, you can do that. The other thing is, I think bankers actually, even in all of their conservatism, are open to data. And so I think that when you're able to show that the project pencils, and you can show excess parking according to whatever the current rules are, that I think that does give you some traction. But I think that would be a great sort of convening of some kind of a discussion or ongoing study group between bankers and developers and planners, and try really to sort that nut.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really insightful. So with the issue of parking meters, you mentioned that it's also a good source of data. And I'm wondering if you looked into the issue of whether people paid for parking with change or they paid for parking with a credit card, and whether if we went back to paying with change, for example, here in Denver, whether, you know, most people don't carry change anymore, so you wouldn't need as much parking, because people wouldn't be paying with change anymore.
So that's I hadn't thought of it from that perspective. I mean, one of the things that I think so obviously we're in a transition period, and there's more paying with by mobile phone or credit card. One of the things I think that happens there then is that actually, in some sense, desensitizes people to what the price signal is. So I think, so from a travel behavior perspective, if I'm putting coins in, it's very tactile, I'm very aware, I'm turn the crank, it's like, I know how much I've spent. Whereas if I just plug my credit card into the machine, I just say set the maximum amount of time. So I think what happens in that scenario is actually people become somewhat less price sensitive. But I also think, but I'm also not sure that that's necessarily a problem, right? So I think one of the things that that we've seen in a few places with parking benefit districts, and I've, hats off to Boulder for having actually invented the parking benefit district in the 70s. When you do collect meter revenue and you are able to invest it back into the neighborhood, either in other transportation improvements, so that would be a sort of a broader transportation benefit district, or as a parking benefit, then you see tremendous returns on that revenue. So whether that, so I think that the change to more electronic payments doesn't in and of itself impact the demand for parking. It certainly makes it easier. One of the things too that I'll say, in a context where parking is constrained, anything that you do to make it easier induces demand. So in the end, it will feel the same to everybody, because more people will do the thing that was easier until it's no longer easier, until it just meets the threshold of how hard it had been. So I think that the real way to get around this is to make other things easier, while not making this also simultaneously easier. I hope that answers your question.
Hi, I'm a consultant working with HDR, but we have a project in the city of Cambridge where we've actually used the city of Seattle's model for the on-street parking, breaking it up into different uses. And it was very effective, I guess, using it from the whole project timeline to identify other needs in the community that would compete with what they call storage in the Seattle model. But there was a lot of resistance with the city and with the other consultants on the team about using the word storage for parking. And I just wondered, from your perspective, talking to people around the country, if you're kind of monitoring how that method is being used across the country in varying levels of success and all that.
I'm glad to hear that you're using it in Cambridge. I know it was featured also in both ITE and NACTO's curb management guides that have been published within the last couple of years, both of those. I'm flattered because I was honored to work with SDOT on that project. And I think it's actually a great idea to sort of try and trace it back and see how many, how it's being implemented and how it's being modified. And I'm sure you're improving on it in Cambridge. I think the storage question is prickly, right? I think it's a little bit designed to, not to be provocative, but to say, hey, this is really what this is. You know, and also in the context of that project and other projects, so I haven't got a robust idea about this, you know, you could think about parking as, you know, there's a 15-minute parking trip, which is when you run into the dry cleaner or the pharmacy, right? That's a quick errand. There's the hour parking, which is for your, maybe for your haircut or a quick lunch. There's a 2-hour parking. There's 4-hour parking when you're at a longer doctor's appointment. And then there's 10-hour parking, which is when you're, you know, you're at work, or 8 hours. I don't know. I work about 20 hours a day, it seems like sometimes. So these are sort of different levels of, they're not all the same parking need, and they're not all the same parking trip. And we don't think very robustly about those differences. Right. So one of the things that makes sense to me is the longer the parking event, the more it really does resemble just storage. Right. I mean, and so that's just actually in the commercial context, and certainly in some residential context, you can imagine a car is not, I mean, I sometimes don't move my car for a week. So really that is storage. Right. So I think to some extent, I guess this gets back to why I wouldn't have called the session "The Slow Death of Urban Parking," because for me it's a little too provocative. But on the other hand, it's true, and it's sort of so how to interface with that reality. Can I ask you a question, which is, did you try some other words, and did you find that you had better traction?
Well, we ended up sort of doing the parking / storage and different ways. I was always kind of struggling to keep the word storage in there to varying levels of success throughout the project. But there was some other small changes to the language for the other uses, but I can't recall the differences. They kept the themes of each of the definitions, basically. It's a River Street reconstruction project, if you want to look it up.
And Cambridge, I will look it up, thank you. And Cambridge is actually very progressive. They've been quite out in front also on a lot of these issues. So interesting to hear some pushback there.
A question and a comment, and I'm going to wrap them in together, and then I'd like your feedback on it. This all makes perfect sense to all of us sitting in the room, but as a city council person, I think about what the reaction would be if we were in a neighborhood meeting. And
yeah,
it does not make perfect sense to the people in the room. So as city leaders of all types do their work, I mean, we really have a very heated discussion about parking, and people think it's their right. We all know this. I don't need to tell everyone what the confusion is.
Yeah.
But Denver is a very young city, and much of our city was developed after World War II, so it's very car oriented. So I'm interested on your feedback on sort of the neighbors versus what is actually practical and makes sense perspective. And then also, have you had any successes working with cities that are more like Denver, that are very car oriented?
Well, I would certainly say Seattle was very car oriented. But the problem is universal in any case. I was I'm going to say November, at a community board meeting on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. There's some concern because of congestion pricing being on the cusp of being implemented here. Would there be a boundary problem? So I went to speak at this community board, And even though only 23% of people in that part of the city are car owners, I think 85 to 90% of the people in the room were car owners, right? So one thing is when you're trying to make changes, I mean, you know this better than I do, when you're trying to make changes where people can sort of see that there's winners and losers, you need to make sure you're connecting with the winners to build that kind of support. And you need to also figure out a way to communicate with the so-called losers that they're not actually losing, right? In none of these scenarios is it really a war on cars. In none of these scenarios is anybody saying, no, you can't drive. So again, I'm sorry to be so parochial. I'll give you another New York example. I spoke to a reporter a couple of months ago who was expressing some concern that the city had converted 6,000 parking spaces over the last 2 years. So on 3 million parking spaces, 6,000 were lost, and that was the screaming headline. 2/3 of them were converted to freight loading zones. Right, so, but the entire piece was pitched in terms of the war on cars. And I had said to the reporter, I said, this is actually a pro-car policy. If we can get the trucks out of the travel way, then you can drive your car more freely through the city, right? But because she wanted to be, fighting about it, then that was that. I recently did a public meeting in Jersey City. I don't love doing public meetings. I'd much rather talk to a friendly audience like you guys. At that meeting in Jersey City, I had never been quite so heckled in my life. And again, this is a situation really where the recommendations in that study are to look more carefully at the issues, are to think about how residential permit parking zones are drawn. Right, but it was just, I mean, people feel threatened. They do feel entitled. They fear that something's being taken from them. I think sometimes logic can carry the day, right? Charrettes, I think, are very useful. Have a working session where people are coming up with solutions. Have them understand that when they don't pay for their own parking, it means that their neighbor is paying for their parking. I think people do have a sense of fairness. So yeah, I mean, it's always a very, very complicated problem. This is not my story, but a good friend of mine, Ralph Danisco, tells this story that he was at a meeting, I think it might even have been in Cambridge, where one of the residents came up and said, my husband sometimes he doesn't come home. He's 3 hours later than he should because he can't find a space to park on our block. And Ralph says to her, well, where does he wind up parking in that case? Usually on the next block over. So we've been having a joke for 5 years how she doesn't have a parking problem. She seems to have a marriage problem.
Dr. Weinberger, this is Bill James. We spoke on the phone about the conference here. Thank you for your being the speaker here. Many of the questions are down the same path. I'm interested in a different perspective on them. The solutions that have happened in the past that you've observed. You mentioned Boulder and Seattle and as places where there's been some movement towards filling the gap, taking the opportunity that there is. What pattern do you see, if any, between among where there's been successes? What have the policymakers done, the leaders in the city done that has experienced success?
So that's a nice question, and actually sort of gives me an idea on the previous question as well, which, I mean, one of the things that Boulder does with their parking revenues is they provide free transit, right? So in terms of being in the community and having that discussion, there comes a question of, should you provide free parking or should you provide free transit? And you can certainly make the case that people who are driving benefit tremendously by people using transit because there's fewer cars therefore on the road, right? So what has the leadership done? Pasadena is a well-known example also of a parking benefit district. where it was old Pasadena was in a shambles. Somehow they managed, the council managed to implement a parking pricing strategy. People think that if you charge at meters, that's going to dissuade people from coming, but really what dissuades people from coming to your area is when they get there and there really is no place for them to park. So the meter revenues in Pasadena then were reinvested in that neighborhood immediately. And while it wasn't obviously the only thing that's responsible for the economic revitalization there, the folks there at least believe that it was a very powerful piece of it. So I think the way that a lot of places have been successful is by having sort of continuity and some sense of civic pride about it. Arlington County has been very successful in some ways with their parking policy. They have been on the same course for 30 or 40 years, without really wavering from it. So there's been a lot of community buy-in. People see the transit improvements, they use them. Ordinary people use transit, right? I think you see that in Boulder. Again, I hate to keep pointing up the road to you, but the ridership, the transit ridership in Boulder is head and shoulders above similar sized cities. I think in the Denver example, I think Fast Tracks has been a kind of a project like Arlington has had in terms of the commitment and the steady commitment that you've had to it. I think that some of the smaller wins could be around how you guys think about pricing the park and ride lots, which lots are full, maybe put a price on them, maybe locals also can pay, just do some experiments in shifting around where the parking demand is so that the supply that you have gets used. I just think, small steps. And I think, again, the examples of, Seattle's a place to watch, Boulder's a place to look at, Pasadena's interesting. Don Shoup has an edited volume out about, came out earlier this year or the very end of last year, called Parking in the City. It's got, I think it's 50 chapters, short readable chapters. Several are by him, but by lots of other people. Some of them are real good concrete examples of what's been done in a variety of places.
Thank you.
Hello. Hey, my question was about how do you get municipalities and private parking lot owners to coordinate pricing? Like, is there a magic like fairy dust that would get someone who charges $1 the municipality for an hour of parking versus the private parking lot that charges $18 or $10 to $15 an hour? How do you get those parties together on a coordinated plan to create that demand management?
So I don't think that private operator is going to drop their price because they're trying to run an operation and that they show that that's what the market will bear. But I think the municipality needs to take notice of that fact, right? If your off-street lot is charging $18 an hour and you're charging $2, you've got to think that you're out of step. And when you think about what the ramifications of that are, you need to think in terms of how can you make it more convenient. Now, that's an example, right? So in the San Francisco case, where the city actually owns a fair amount of parking, many cities don't own the off-street parking. New York City does not, for example. In San Francisco, in the SF Park, when it was in the experimental phase, in the pilot phase, they wound up dropping their off-street prices because their garages were so undersubscribed. So a private operator is not going to drop their prices, so the city is going to have to figure out how to coordinate that. I say coordinate in that case.
Hi, I represent a church in downtown Denver that's looking to develop its parking lots. We have an aging population, and so the pushback on losing parking lots, both in terms of looking for new locations and proximity and numbers. So how do you look at demographics of the population? How does that affect parking? what kind of studies have been made on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the, excuse me, the bigger amount of research on the demographic question is your aging population is actually going to have to stop driving at some point, right? So, I mean, I know that there's a tremendous tendency to want to continue driving. My mother, for example, she's 83. She's still driving, at least in the daytime. She'll drive at night, according to her, when she's on a road she's familiar with, but she's assured me she will not drive at night, even on a familiar road, when she has my children in the car. And I am horrified. I mean, I'm glad she won't threaten the lives of my children, but I'm like, Mom, if you will not drive, if it's not safe to drive because my kids are in your car, it is not safe for you to drive, right? So there's going to be a point at which the issue of the aging population is they need other transportation options. And so it's, as much as our sense of independence comes from our sense of independent mobility. And so it becomes a critically important social issue, I think, for us to create independent mobility that does not actually mean driving a car. So I think for the constituents that you're concerned about, it seems like some progress toward understanding what that future looks like. Millennials are driving at a lower rate. Maybe this is why Rocky Mountain Institute thinks that 2020 is peak car year. People are delaying getting licenses, although that's just delay. And then people do need to start dropping out of driving sooner. So I think that that's going to, in general, reduce the demand for driving. Now, one of the things I like to say, and we need to think about really, is there is no demand for parking per se. There's only demand for access. And to the extent that the only way we provide access to our activities is by driving, that is what drives the demand for parking. So just like we say that the demand for transportation in some sense is derived from our desire to be at a different location, our demand for parking really is derived from automobile access being the privileged, or in many, many cases, only access option. So I think that, I think it's great that you're looking to develop the parking lot. I think especially if you're in downtown Denver, there are many good transit options in Denver, and increasingly good transit options. Even though my friends from Denver tell me that RTD stands for reason to drive, and I understand the issue with the bus driver shortage, and I'm looking forward to seeing how you work around that. But I think in terms of that aging population and getting them to activities, that is a non-car future.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I was wondering if you are aware of any research or case studies on trip reduction plans, travel demand management plans that have been successful or modestly successful in reducing or persuading office developers to reduce parking need, such as regional transit passes, carpool programs, et cetera, so that we don't get an end result of office developments that are, or buildings that are 30 stories and a third of it is parking, and it's right on proximate to excellent transit in the downtown area.
Yeah, so top of mind is Arlington County, where they do site plan review for all major development, and they also require TDM. So they're very aggressive, I should say, even about trip reduction strategies and seeking to implement parking that's appropriate to the trip reduction objective. There are a couple other places not coming right to mind. I'll get in touch with Stuart, who can relay that to you with additional resources if that's useful.
Hi, thank you for a tremendous presentation. So there's the concept that draconian limitations, that draconian measures that severely restrict parking supply will organically drive traffic towards transportation alternatives, assuming there are sufficient transportation alternatives. Is this effective, or will people continue to cruise around looking for spaces?
So let me just check with my crystal ball. I think draconian is hard to do, but I think you can sort of get there incrementally. But I think that one of the things, I mean, I think again that Boulder recognizes that cities can't compete with the suburbs on suburban terms, right? I know, I mean, I looked up that there was some alarmist concern that when Cherry Creek Mall started charging, you know, it's no longer did free parking for the first hour, and now you're up to $2 an hour, and how that was going to drive people to other malls. There's an attraction to Cherry Creek that's different from other malls. And honestly, when I'm going to Nordstrom and spending $600 on clothing on one item, I'm not that concerned about spending $2 on parking. So I think that there's some, but it's unclear that, I mean, so that's not the person who's going to stop driving. That person's just going to pay for the parking. And that money is going to give you an opportunity to, you know, to underwrite the bike share program so that somebody else doesn't have to drive, right? So, I mean, you can't think of it in terms of what, you know, each individual is going to do, but what the collective response starts to look like. And, you know, again, I was talking to a friend from Australia, and he was telling me how he took his family to see the Harry Potter theater production, which is, you know, I think he said it was $150 per person per night. So that was $1,200 for theater for his family of 4. And then it was dinner, and then they're going to quibble over $5 or $10 to park. I mean, we hear that all the time. I'm not, but I don't know. I have very little faith that people really, I mean, I think also what we see when tolls get increased in any toll facility is there's an initial drop, and then the traffic tends to rise back up. So what you want is sort of over the whole system, there only needs to be very small shifts to make a big difference. And then when you start getting momentum on your side, then you can, I mean, there's nothing's going to be, I mean, we're not going to turn Denver into Paris in terms of transit, but there's lots of ways to do park once type of strategies, or park remotely types of strategies, or even just take better advantage of the existing parking rather than building more, because building parking is, you know, construction is very expensive. And it's somewhat unsightly, I think. And I mean, you can do beautiful wraps around your garages and so forth, but surface lots are problematic. Structured parking is very expensive. There's just lots of concerns.
Thank you again for your presentation. I found it very interesting. I was particularly intrigued with your notion that we separate land use from transportation management. And I was wondering if you meant that as a mental exercise, because I think I absolutely agree with you, or could we do something as crazy as just deleting all the transportation management language out of our zoning code? And then I got to thinking that so much of our land is devoted to cars, and how would one go about actually deleting transportation management out of land use, and has any other city done such thing?
So what I think is that parking really truly is at the crosshairs of transportation and land use planning, and that's where it sort of needs to be, but it's not. So I think actually a better integration rather than a separation is likely what's called for. But what I think happens too often is that when land use planners aren't thinking of the transportation implications, so they're thinking of what the site requirements are, and they're not thinking of the system requirements. So, you know, back when I was in engineering school, they said to us, well, transportation systems are made up of terminals, rights of way, and vehicles, right? And in the case of the auto highway system, the terminal is the parking space, right? So we don't leave it to land use planners who aren't doing the route planning to figure out where to put the bus stops. right? We don't leave it to the land use planners to, to develop the airport terminals, right? So for some reason, we're not thinking of this in a system-wide kind of a way. I mean, one of the ways this was driven home to me in an incredibly vivid sort of a way is I was invited to China some years ago, and the level, I was in Guangzhou, which is in the south, the level of traffic on the roads really was such that there wasn't enough arterial capacity to bring cars into the number of parking spaces that had been built. Right, so there's got to be, there's waste in that system somewhere. And in that case, it was all of this excess parking that could never be utilized because you just couldn't even get more cars on the street to get them into the parking spots. So I think an integration rather than an elimination. Portland is the only city that I'm aware of that even takes into consideration, well, now more places are doing TOD transit, TOD overlays particularly for parking requirements, but by and large, there's very few cities that think about what the transportation constellation is when they're thinking about how they set their parking minimums.
Other questions?
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Jyotsna Vishwakarma with RTD. So wanted to ask, this is slightly off topic but related. The automobile world has very well defined trip generation models. You know, you can correlate development to how many trips or parking spaces are needed. Is there work being done on generating people trip generation models? So, you know, you could look at the density of a development or what's in the neighborhood and predict how many people will be traveling or, you know, coming out and, you know, using adjacent amenities or spaces that are being built.
So I'm sorry, the audio feed just went very wonky, but I think your question was to do with trip generation. It wasn't the mic, it was the internet.
Trip generation models for people. I mean,
was the very first part of your question referencing
hello?
ITE?
I'm sorry.
Okay, so I'm gonna, and because it's gotten a little choppy, I'm gonna answer the question I think that you're asking, right? So on the one hand, we rely very heavily on ITE for trip generation. We also rely very heavily on ITE's parking generation guide, but there are other models. The EPA sponsored a model called MXD for mixed development. Reed Ewing at the University of Utah has done a lot of work. I worked with him a little bit at the beginning of this project, looking in particular at trip generation at TOD sites and what the parking needs are. DDOT, Washington DC DOT, has been developing their own trip generation model because they were concerned that by using ITE trip generation, they were predicting far more vehicle trips than actually were realized, and they were over mitigating for automobile traffic and thereby inviting additional automobile. So there are some efforts around the country to address that differently. I hope that was your question. I hope that's the answer. Good answer.
Yes, it was. Thank you.
So I think we're gonna call it a day, or at least a presentation. I don't want more frustration with the wonky internet connection, but I got to say, for the most part, this has been a revelation that this could actually work. I'm really impressed.
Yeah, right.
Dr. Weinberger, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. And I'm glad to stay. The internet's been fine up until this last couple of minutes. And I'm very glad to stay on and listen to the panel discussion if you don't mind having me. And if there are any questions that come up, I'm happy to continue to address them.
That would be amazing if you could actually participate in the panel. That would be spectacular. But let's see if we can do that and hang on. So for right now, we're gonna break, give folks a chance to stretch their legs and not shake hands with each other, and we'll reconvene in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Great.